On November 7, 1917, Bolsheviks seized control of Russia in what would become known as the October Revolution. Legislation was passed in 1918 that seized all property from the church, dissolved the church as a legal entity, and excluded it from all participation in public education. In 1929, the law on religious associations removed the church's ability to advertise itself or defend itself from anti-religious propaganda. Thousands of churches were closed, and the few that remained open were only open for the purpose of celebrating the liturgy under the watchful eye of the militant atheist government. Bibles were outlawed. Charitable and social work was prohibited. The only instruction that could be given to parishioners was through sermons, and even then the government spies were present, with the threat of the priests being dragged away in the night and the church doors closed if the wrong thing was said. The church became cowed and submissive. Eventually, starting in the late 1960s, the people, who are the defenders of the faith, began to rise up against this tyranny, with no encouragement from the Patriarch or the Holy Synod. In 1965, 2 Moscow priests wrote an open letter to the Patriarch saying, in part, "The suffering church turns to you with hope. You have been invested with the staff of primatial authority. You have the power as Patriarch to put an end to this lawlessness with one word. Do this." The priests were suspended. In 1972, Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote his Lenten Letter. Let's listen to it now. A Lenten Letter by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, April 9, 1972. Most Holy Master, that which presses upon the head like a gravestone and crushes the breast of a moribund Russian Orthodox people is the subject of this letter. Everyone knows this, and it has already been shouted aloud, but everyone has again reverted to a doomed silence. And a small stone needed to be placed on top of the larger one to make it no longer possible to remain silent. I was weighed down by such a small stone when I heard your message on Christmas Eve. I felt a pang at that point when, perhaps for the first time in half a century, you finally spoke about children, suggesting the following precept: that along with infusing their children with love for their country, parents should foster in them a love for the church, and apparently for faith itself. And they should strengthen that love by setting a good personal example. I heard this and saw before me my early childhood, spent in attending many church services, and remembered that initial impression, exceptionally fresh and pure, which later could not be erased by any millstone or mental theory. But what is the purpose of all of this? Why is your earnest appeal directed only at Russian immigrants? Why do you call only those children to be brought up in the Christian faith? Why do you admonish only the distant flock to discern slander and falsehood, and be strong in truth and justice? And we, should we discern? Should we or should we not foster in our own children a love for the church? Yes, Christ taught us to search even for the 100th sheep that was lost, when the remaining 99 are found. But when even the 99 are missing, should we not concern ourselves, first of all, in their behalf? Why was it necessary for me to show my passport when I came to church to baptize my son? With what sort of canonical demands must the Moscow Patriarchate comply in registering the souls of those who are being baptized? One must wonder at the spiritual strength of the parents and at the fathomless spiritual resistance inherited through the ages with which they go through this denunciatory registration and must later face the persecution at their place of employment or the public ostracism of ignoramuses. At this point, persistence runs out. After the baptizing of infants, all of the child's associations with the church usually cease. The doors to a religious upbringing are tightly shut against them. They are barred from participating in church services, taking communion, and perhaps even from attending church. We are robbing our children by depriving them of that unrepeatable, purely angelic perception of the church service, which in adult life can never be recaptured nor even understood as to what has been lost. The right to propagate the faith of our fathers has been broken, as well as the right of parents to bring up their children within the precepts of their own world outlook. And you, leaders of the church, have yielded to this and condone it by accepting as reliable evidence of religious freedom the fact that we must place our defenseless children not into neutral hands, but into those of the most primitive and unscrupulous kind of atheistic propagandists. You find evidence of religious freedom in the fact that adolescents torn away from Christianity, God forbid that they should be infected by it, are left with the ravine between the agitator's manual and the criminal code for their moral upbringing. Half a century of our past history has been neglected. I do not even speak of rescuing the present, but how can we save our country's future? The future which will be constituted by today's children. In the final analysis, the true and profound destiny of our country will depend on whether the idea of rightness and power shall be irrevocably implanted in the people's consciousness, or whether that darkening eclipse shall be cleansed and the power of righteousness radiate once again. Will we be able to reinstate within ourselves at least some of the traces of Christianity, or shall we lose them completely and surrender ourselves to the calculations of self-preservation and profit? A study of Russian history in the last few centuries will show that it might have been incomparably more humane and harmonious if the Church had not surrendered its independence and the people had listened to its voice, as, for example, in Poland. Alas, with us it has been different for a long time. We were losing and have lost that bright, ethical Christian atmosphere in which our values, way of life, world outlook, folklore, and even the word peasant have been founded for thousands of years. We are losing the last traces and signs of a Christian people. Is it possible that this should not be the main concern of the Russian Patriarch? The Russian Church has its indignant opinion on every evil in distant Asia or Africa, yet on internal ills it has none, ever. Why are the messages which we receive from the church hierarchy traditionally tranquil? Why are all church documents so complacent, as if they were issued among the most Christian of peoples? One serene message follows another in the course of the same inclement year. Will not the need for these messages soon cease altogether? There will no longer be anyone left to whom they should be addressed. The flock will disappear, with the exception of the patriarchal chancellery office. Almost 7 years have passed since two honest priests, Yakunin and Eshleman, wrote their famous letter to your predecessor, in which they demonstrated through personal sacrifice that the pure flame of the Christian faith has not as yet been extinguished in our country. They described in an extensive and convincing fashion the voluntary internal enslavement of the Russian Church, which has reached the point of self-annihilation, and asked that anything which was untrue be pointed out to them. But every word was true. None of the hierarchs took it upon themselves to refute them. And how was their letter answered? In a most simple and crude manner. For telling the truth, they were forbidden to conduct services. And up to this very day you have not corrected this. The frightening letter of the 12 believers from Vyatka has also remained unanswered. They were only put under pressure. And the only fearless archbishop, Yermogen of Kaluga, is still in monastic seclusion. It was he who forbade the closing of his churches and the burning of icons and books, an accomplishment in which degenerate enraged atheism achieved great success up to 1964 in other dioceses. It is almost 7 years now that all of this was said aloud. But what has changed? For every functioning church, there are 20 that have been razed or irretrievably ruined, and another 20 are in a state of neglect or profanation. Is there a sight more harrowing than these skeletons, the sole domain of birds and storekeepers? How many populated places are there in this country where the closest church is 100 or even 200 kilometers away? And our north, that age-old repository of Russian spirit and perhaps Russia's most dependable future, is left entirely without churches. Any attempt on the part of church activists, donors, or bequesters to restore even the smallest church is blocked by the one-sided laws of the so-called division of church and state. We dare not ask about the pealing of church bells. Why is Russia deprived of her ancient adornment, her most beautiful voice? But how can we speak of churches? There are even no gospel books. These are brought to us from abroad, in the same way as our own preachers used to take them to Indigirka. This is the 7th year, and has the church asserted itself on anything? The entire administration of the church, the appointment of priests, mid-bishops, including even sacrilegious churchmen who make it easier to deride and destroy the church. All of this is secretly managed by the Council for Religious Affairs. A church dictatorially ruled by atheists is a sight not seen in 2,000 years. Also, under their control is the church economy and the use of church resources, those coins deposited by the fingers of the devout. 5 million rubles are donated to outside funds with magnanimous gestures, while beggars are chased away from the portico, and there is no money to repair a leaking roof in a poor parish. Priests are powerless within their own parishes. Only the conduct of church services is still entrusted to them, and even then, only if they remain within the church building. But if they wish to visit the bedside of the sick or a cemetery, they must first ask for approval from the city council. What sort of reasoning can be used to convince oneself that the consistent destruction of the spirit and body of the church by atheists is the best means for its preservation? Preservation for whom? Certainly not for Christ. Preservation by what means? Falsehood? But after falsehood, what sort of hands should perform the Eucharist? Most Holy Master, do not scorn entirely my unworthy outcry. You will probably not hear one like it every 7 years. Do not let us suppose, not make us think, that for the high priests of the Russian Church, earthly authority is higher than heavenly authority, earthly responsibility more frightening than the responsibilities before God. Let us not deceive the people, and more importantly, let us not deceive ourselves while praying, by thinking that external fetters are stronger than our spirit. It was not any easier at the time of Christianity's birth, but it has survived and flourished and has shown us the way, that of sacrifice. He who is deprived of all material power is always victorious through sacrifice. The same martyrdom worthy of the first centuries was accepted by our priests and fellow believers in our living memory. But at that time they were thrown to the lions. Today, one can only lose well-being. During these days, when the cross is brought out to the middle of the church and you kneel before it, ask the Lord, what other purpose could there be for your serving a people which has lost the spirit of Christianity and the Christian image? Great Lent, Sunday of Veneration of the Cross, 1972. Translated by Ludmila Thorn.